My name is Tracy Fenwick. I'm a lecturer in the School of Politics and the director of the Australian Centre for Federalism. On behalf of myself and Elizabeth Mayer, who's the director of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies. Elizabeth, we're happy to welcome you tonight to a co-organized public lecture. I'm very pleased to present Dr. Lucas González, who's going to be talking about 30 years of Argentine democratization, consolidation or recurrent crisis. Lucas is a professor at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín and is also a researcher at CONICET. He's been here for 2 weeks. We've had some great times in terms of forwarding research agendas and doing collaborative work, so it's really great that he agreed to do this public lecture. And it is also being sponsored graciously by the Argentine Embassy and His Excellency Hugo Gobi, so I'd like to thank the Embassy as well for their participation. And the ambassador would like to have the first 5 minutes. And we have quite a tight timetable, so if after, I know you're not an academic, but if you go on too long and you see me doing this. But no, I would like to welcome His Excellency, please, and have the first few words.
Thank you. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted that you could join us on this important occasion to explore the history and democracy of Argentina. Firstly, I would like to thank the ANU, Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies, ANCLAS, and the ANU, Australian Centre for Federalism, ACF, for co-hosting this event. In particular, I would like to thank the director of ANCLAS, Dr. Elizabeth Mayer, and the director of ACF, Dr. Tracy Fenwick. A conference of such high caliber would not be made possible without a wealth of knowledge and experience of the Latin American region provided by Dr. Mayer, nor the political and economic expertise of Dr. Fenwick in the area. Finally, it is a great honor to introduce Dr. Lucas González, a member of ANCLAS and a visiting fellow of the National University of San Martín in Buenos Aires, for presenting this public conference. Dr. González has an impressive curriculum and has traveled all over the world conducting research into the federal democracies, particularly in the Latin American region, among other political science areas of expertise. Without further ado, I present to you our honored guest and speaker for tonight, who I am sure will enrich all of our knowledge in this area. Thank you.
Thank you for being here to all of you. A special thanks to the organizers, Dr. Tracy Fenwick, who invited me to spend some days here at the university. I really enjoy them. Dr. Elizabeth Mayer, also from ANCLAS, thank you very much for co-hosting, and also to the embassy and to the ambassador, of course. It's a pleasure for you to be here. Let me start the presentation by saying that it was quite a challenging topic for me, and we can evaluate democracies according to policy outcomes. And Argentina would have fared well in some regards, for instance, human rights, or even social policies in particular areas such as inequality, or even in terms of criminality. Argentina does well in some of these areas. In others, it doesn't, especially in some economic indicators, such as GDP growth. If you pay attention to the region, the Argentine economy has not fared well during the last 30 years. It grew half the rate of Brazil, and when the economy sank, it sank a lot, much more than Brazil, 3 times higher decrease in the economy when it sank. So the evaluation can be mixed in that regards, in terms of policy outcomes. My presentation is going to be a presentation not in terms of policy outcome, but rather a presentation on the functioning of democracy. So I divided the presentation in 4 parts. I'm going to discuss very shortly a conceptual classification Guillermo O'Donnell made to differentiate representative democracies and the delegative democracies. I'm going to show you some empirical classification of 11 Latin American cases, so we have a picture of where the region stands across time, 30 years. to get into some details of the Argentine case, particularly during the last 30 years, and some notes on the last administration, the current administration. But I would like to also to discuss with you why some democracies are classified as delegative democracies, and these characteristics of delegative democracies are recurrent in some cases while not in others. Of course, I'm going to claim that Argentina is a recurrent delegative democracy, and I hope we can discuss why is that the case, and if you agree with that classification as well. Of course, the presentation is going to be mostly on the case of Argentina, but I hope we can discuss some other cases as well. You probably know the case, this study from Guillermo O'Donnell. It was a piece in 1994 called Delegative Democracies. According to O'Donnell, delegative democracies are democracies in the sense that they meet all the criteria for a polyarchy. That is, you have contestation, you have participation, you have basic political and civil rights respected, but they have some problems, especially in terms of their institutionalization, and particularly in terms of the mechanisms of horizontal accountability, the division of power, and the functioning of this division of power. This is one of the most important quotes from O'Donnell. I'm not reading it. But basically what he says is these democracies, although they respect elections and the incumbent accept that there is a term limit, during the actual governing period, he or she will do all she or he can, only with the limits of the hard facts of existing power relations. I think it's an important quote, and I'm very glad we are here to discuss it, and particularly in the case of Argentina. As you know, in that piece, O'Donnell was being a political theorist. He was not worried about the empirical implication of his work. He was preparing a challenging piece for us to discuss which are the problems with some democracies, particularly Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. I will discuss that in a moment. The first piece of my work had to do with trying to find some attributes in O'Donnell's classification of delegative democracies for which we could find observable empirical implications. So it was a lot of work. The first one that we can find is that the president in a delegative democracy is taken to be the embodiment of the nation and the custodian and the definer of its interest. The policies of his government need bear no resemblance to the promises of campaigns. The president's political base is a political movement, that is, they do not have consolidated institutionalized parties, and more importantly, other institutions, particularly the legislative power and the judiciary, are limits, impediments to the exercise of power. The exercise of power is non-institutionalized, and by that it's extremely difficult to find empirical implications of that, but he was discussing this. The president nominates isolated technicals in office, and more importantly, as I mentioned before, there are weak or non-existent mechanisms of horizontal accountability. The check and balances do not work well, and control institutions do not do their work. And Swiss policy making. As decisions depend on the president takes the decision that he or she thinks is the best, and there are very high likelihood of gross mistakes, hazardous implementation, and the president takes responsibility for the outcomes. So this is the basic characteristics that I could find out of the piece. If you read it, there are several others that are even more difficult than these ones here to actually observe in a democracy. When O'Donnell was thinking about delegative democracies, he was thinking particularly about these three guys, Menem, Fujimori, and Collor de Mello. He was also thinking of Sarney, and to some extent, Alan Garcia. So he basically, in his piece, classified Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru as delegative democracies. Chile and Uruguay were classified by O'Donnell as representative democracies. That is, the first cases had problems with check and balances, the division of power, and the mechanism of horizontal accountability. They did not have consolidated institutionalized parties that were limits to the exercise of power for the president. The other two democracies, Chile and Uruguay, were institutionalized and consolidated democracies for O'Donnell. There were some problems with his classification. First of all, what do we do with the case of Brazil? Brazil moved away from a clearly delegative democracy during Collor into a more representative one. And you will see the classification of, and I'll show you how I classify them. But during Fernando Henrique Cardoso, first, during Lula da Silva, during Dilma Rousseff, Brazil moved away from a delegative democracy, and it's probably now moving again into one. So there is a dynamic component that it wasn't clear in the first piece. It is also the case of Venezuela. Venezuela, according to these elements in the definition, was more or less a consolidated democracy during several years, but it moved away to a more clear case of delegative democracy during Chavez, and it's probably not even classified as a democracy. We can discuss that today. And there are problems with the cut points. When Mexico started being a democracy in the sense that there is a polyarchy, and it can be classified as delegative or representative, and when it was an authoritarian regime. Also with the case of Mexico. With the case of Venezuela. What did I do for the classification? Well, I asked 30 country specialists. They are all listed, and in the piece I showed whether they agree or not and how much they disagree. Each of them classified 11 cases. Most of them were specialists in the countries, and some of them classified more than one case. So each case had at least 3 persons classifying, specialists classifying these dimensions. And I know it's a very simple proxy of these attributes, because it relies on an expert classifying them, but at least it's a good way to initialize the discussion. During 30 years, without the periods of authoritarian rule, that is, Mexico, according to the specialists, they wouldn't classify it as a democracy pre-94, and there were also some discussion with the case of Venezuela during the last few years. In the 8 I showed them these 8 dimensions. They all knew the piece, and I showed them these dimensions with a definition of what they represent, and they classified each of the cases in 9 categories, ranging from a full representative democracy to a full delegative democracy. There are 2 groups in the classifications. The first one, in which Argentina is part, are called recurrent delegative democracies. There are cases with ups and downs. Some of the 8 dimensions are present during some periods of time, and many of them are not during some others. I will get into some details in the case of Argentina later, but this is the case of Colombia and Ecuador as well. Some of these attributes were present in some years and not in others. The second group is what I call eroding delegative democracies. Those are cases in which some of these attributes were present, many of them, in the case of Brazil, all of them, were present during the period that O'Donnell analyzed the case, that is during Collor de Mello. But then all the country specialists agreed that many of these attributes were not present anymore. They maybe disagreed whether one of the other were present or not, but they all agree that these elements were disappearing in the case of Brazil up to 2010. I would like to discuss, especially, I know there are specialists and Brazilians in the audience, what is happening with Brazil nowadays. It's a very concerning issue, at least for me, and I hope for many others as well. And the case of Peru, it's very similar. During Fujimori, all the 8 dimensions were clearly present, and most of the country specialists agree that, all of them agree that most of these dimensions were gradually disappearing. They didn't agree which one were disappearing or not, but these specialists agreed that these 2 cases were entering a phase of more consolidated and institutionalized democracies, different from the first group. This is this is the group that is performing the worst. These are the cases in which during certain periods of time, most of these attributes were not present and gradually started to appear. This is what I call strengthening delegative democracies. And of course, there are some disagreements on what happened in Bolivia during certain periods of time, but most of the persons coding the case agree that during the last few years, many of the attributes, not all of them, many, 6, were present. The same with Paraguay. This is the Lugo years. And again, the very difficult case to classify was Venezuela, because most of the codifiers agree that several of the attributes were present during Chavez years, but then there was a lot of discussion on what to do with Venezuela, whether it was actually a delegative democracy or was O'Donnell called sliding towards authoritarianism. And I would classify today Venezuela as not as a polyarchy. There are some critical elements which are not present there. But of course, this is a matter of discussion. 26 people were killed in the last few days. This is terrible what is happening there. And I'm glad there are politicians here to discuss this as well. This is the best performing group, and Mexico. It's none of the persons classifying Mexico agree on where to put it. So it's all the stable and the Mexican case. Let's go first to the stable democracies. All of the persons coding Uruguay agree that none of the dimensions were present, and that was unique. I had 5 people classifying Uruguay because the first 3 agreed that none of the attributes were present, and all of them agreed that none of them were present. So the best performing out of the 11 is Uruguay. Some of the elements of delegative democracies were present in Chile, especially técnicos during some years, very isolated técnicos during some years, but these 2 are very stable and consolidated and institutionalized democracies. Mexico is a difficult case because most of the persons codifying agree that it was not a democracy before 1994, but still I got it classified in another group. Out of this very simple exercise, one important thing appears. On average, these democracies perform well. They are very weakly representative democracies on average. The average is 3.2. But that's an important thing. Out of these 11 democracies, this usual picture of Latin America having populist leaders trashing political institutions and parties is not a very clear picture. It's more mixed, and that is also measured by the standard deviation. There is a lot of variation among the cases. On average, they tend to be stable democracies, but there is a lot of variation among Latin American democracies. That's an important topic. Another topic, of course, O'Donnell, he was not alive when I did this work, and I think I'm glad. But O'Donnell thought of this concept, especially adjusting it to 3 cases. O'Donnell wouldn't make concepts travel too far. I would make them travel far. And I would like to use these attributes and classify democracies beyond the Latin American cases. I don't think, and we can see it nowadays, if you pay attention to the case to the US, it's a very clear case in which some of these attributes are there, and I cannot see anything why a DNA in Latin America should be linked to populism or delegative democracies and not in other cases. We can include not only Bush during several years, some of the attributes were there, but also nowadays, and even Spain too during some years. So I think it's a very challenging exercise. I'm just opening up the discussion. So, on average, the democracies in Argentina, these 11 democracies, tend to be more representative than delegative, although there is a lot of variation among them. Let's get for some moment into the Argentine case. I'm not Argentina is classified, has been classified as a case of recurrent delegative democracies, in the sense that if you pay attention during the Alfonsine years, 88, 83, 80, 89, very few attributes were present during those years. And most of the specialistas classifying the case would agree on that. All of them agree that all of these 8 attributes were present at least during part of the Menem years, especially at the very beginning. These elements eroded gradually, or these attributes disappeared gradually during the last few years, some of them, and then some of these attributes were not present during the first years of De la Rúa. But gradually De la Rúa started showing, or his government started showing some of these attributes as well. Again, many of these components of delegative democracy appeared during the Dualde years and during the Kirchners, to indicate that during Cristina, most of them, if not all of them, were present during those years. Of course, there are some discussions, and it tended to be very polarized, the classifications according to where you are in the political spectrum, and even some very much aligned, political scientists in Argentina, very much aligned with the government, the previous government, would claim that this classification was a nonsensical exercise. And of course, we can discuss that as well. But the first thing that appears to Argentina, and I think, other than discussing which were the dimensions, we can do that, of course. I want to discuss it a little bit. I will spend some time discussing why Argentina has this recurrent trend that is shared with some others, but not with other cases in the region. But before that, let's talk for a moment about what is happening today with Argentina. Can we find some of these attributes in the current government of Mauricio Macri? I don't think Macri is celebrating. It's a very famous picture, and I think I tried to pick up one that represents him very well. But I don't think he considers himself the custodian of the national interest the way O'Donnell was thinking about. But clearly, his party and himself has this discourse that they were saving the Republic, La República. No? So there is it's not exactly the same, but this discourse that there are certain elements in democracies that are going to be protected only by this party, to some extent are present in the current government. I think his policies resemble very well campaign promises. His policies resemble very well campaign promises, although many of these policies are giving very bad results. So it's not a problem of promises, it's a problem of results, actually, I think. I think there are troubles with the political party, because this is not an institutionalized party in the way O'Donnell would think about it. And these parties are clearly parties with leadership. I mean, Macri is the main leader in the party, and they are going to face troubles when they have to renew this key figure in the party. And this party doesn't function as an institutionalized party, in the sense that check and balances from the party are very weak. Unfortunately, I think this party that came into power defending the separation of power, I think it's very close to a delegative democracy, in the sense that several elements in Congress and to some extent in part of the judiciary were considered impediments of power, if not by the president directly, by some members of the government. So it's not extremely clear that this is a president that is going to go all for an institutionalized democracy. And if I have to risk, I think this government is closer to a delegative democracy, and especially to the Kirchner years, much more than any of the previous governments, with one problem: the social policies are not delivering the goods as in the previous period. The other elements, it's very complex, this whether the exercise of power is institutionalized or not, but clearly some elements are present, especially in terms of the weak horizontal accountability. The president takes the decision. This swift policy making is clearly there. Gross mistakes were made in several aspects, and I think it's not only a matter of gross mistakes, but it's a matter of how much consensus is built with the other political forces. And this has been something not extremely clear, especially in Congress. Although he had some support in Congress, I see it, and this is probably a matter of personal opinion, I see it more a collaboration based on political scandals and whether or not former public officials are going to be in a judicial process or not, that this collaboration is forced rather than genuinely build up in Congress as we would expect in a clear institutionalized democracy. So the picture is kind of gray. Some elements have improved, and it was a chicana, we know that word in Argentina, that social policies are not delivering. I'm not classifying democracies according to the outcomes, as I said, but what I wanted to show here regarding Argentina nowadays, and I can get into the details later during Q&A, but this is a party that came into power defending institutions, the Republican component in a democracy that is not clearly performing well in that direction. Or I would challenge that some of I would claim that some of these dimensions are present in current government, and it's still far from being a clear representative democracy as Uruguay is, for instance. This is to wake you up and foster the discussion later, because it's late and you must be all tired. So I hope we can have some discussion later on. Let me go to the last part of the presentation. It's going to take me 10 minutes, and I hope we have some discussion later. But why there are some democracies that are recurrent in some cases and not in others. And especially I'm going to discuss this for the case of Argentina. That is the case we are discussing today mostly. Let's go back to O'Donnell. O'Donnell said that this is not new. There is a long history in Latin America of plebiscitary tendencies, and this is all part of that. He avoided calling delegative democracies cases of populism, and can get into the details on why is that the case, but he was mainly paying attention to the institutional functioning of the democracy and not only to the political discourse or the social elements in it. He was paying attention to the political regime. O'Donnell also claimed that economic crisis has a key role in explaining the emergence, and especially he was paying attention to the transition years. He said, especially for the case of Argentina, the case of Brazil, and to some extent the case of Peru, that these countries inherited very heavy economic burdens out of their military dictatorship, and that forced presidents to concentrate power and take decisions, in some cases unilaterally. A very strong sense of urgency in the population. If you remember the Alfonsine years, democracy will solve all the troubles from Argentina, and suddenly you end up in a huge hyperinflation crisis, one of the highest inflation in Latin America and one of the highest in the world, and a huge rise in poverty and unemployment, and a strong sense of urgency in the population that we need to get rid of this economic situation. Under those circumstances, O'Donnell claimed confidence in government, in party, and in all political institutions collapses. And of course, the prestige of political parties and politicians also sank in the case of Argentina. You remember during the 2001-2002 crisis, the leitmotiv was que se vayan todos. We want them all out. So under those conditions, economic crisis and very low confidence in politics, in politicians, and in political institutions, what you have is demands for urgent action and a political leader concentrating power, because that's the only way, at least some of these political figures claim, to get out of this economic situation. And there is a cycle of crisis, because as long as, and that was O'Donnell claims, as long as you perform well, you will have support in public opinion. If you start performing bad, then the delegation is over. We retain the power as citizens, and we call for elections again. And there is a new cycle of crisis in terms of the strong sense of urgency linked to the economic crisis. Again, a new cycle of low confidence in all political institutions and parties, and a new cycle of concentration of power. Let's go to the empirical analysis of it. So, if we agree on O'Donnell's claims, we are gonna argue that delegative democracies are more likely to emerge and more likely to intensify when economic crises are deeper and confidence in democracy, government institutions, political parties, and politicians is lower. So what I try to do is, out of this empirical classification of delegative democracies, I ran a very simple logistic regression analysis to analyze whether these very simple components are present or not. The dependent variable, or what I'm trying to explain, is delegative democracy in that index that I showed you at the very beginning, and I will analyze whether structural factors, that is inflation, economic growth, public debt, and inequality and GDP per capita, have an impact on the likelihood of entering in one camp or the other. I also include, following O'Donnell's argument, I also include what can be called the cultural component in the analysis, that is confidence in institutions. I take this data from Latino Barometro and La Pop. These are regional polls asking citizens, it's about 1,400, 1,500 individuals for each country. They ask what is their confidence in government and the political institutions, parties, and of course support for democracy and satisfaction with democracy. And I also include some basic political institutional factors such as partisan fragmentation, polarization, etc. Which are the results? I'm not going to show all the numbers and all the figures because you're going to be bored, but I think the results are interesting, and I hope we can discuss them too. What I found is that if you put all the variables, that is the economic and the cultural confidence on average, on their average, in the sample, you will have 74% probability of being in one of the four categories of representative democracies. That is, if you perform on average, as well as the rest of the Latin American countries, in terms of the economy, these indicators of inflation, economic growth, inequality, and stuff, and you have support for democracy and the basic political institutions in the average of Latin America, it's more likely that you're going to end up in the representative camp. And what I will do now is try to move the values of the different variables and see whether this likelihood changes. So let's go to very critical economic conditions, and that is, some of these indicators are all in Argentina. The lowest values of GDP growth, Argentina sank 16% in 2002. GDP decreased 16% in 2002. The highest inflation is not in Argentina, it's in Bolivia and Peru, but Argentina is extremely close to that hyperinflation. So you get these extremely bad economic conditions, and the likelihood of being in a delegative democracy is now 73%. So it goes from 74 of being a representative democracy to 73 of being a delegative one. So this is the third component. When you get the economic crisis Argentina gets, and then we will have to explain why Argentina has recurrent economic crisis, but still, if you get them, the likelihood of being a delegative democracy, on average, according to the data we have, increases substantially. Then let's go to the support for democracy. Let's put all the variables in their means. That is, let's perform on average as the rest of the countries in the group. And let's have support for democracy in the highest. That is the values for Uruguay. Argentina has very high values for support for democracy. It's a very interesting case because support for the democracy as a regime is very high, but support for the or confidence in the institutions of democracy is extremely low, one of the lowest. Confidence in party, in the judiciary, in Congress, in unions, it's very low compared to the rest of the countries. But what I do here is, let's put all the variables in their means, and let's move confidence to the highest, the levels of Uruguay. You have 91% probabilities of being in a representative camp. Let's move support to democracy to the lowest, that is Paraguay. Paraguay had the lowest value in the series, 34%, and it's an underperforming case for all the variables in terms of confidence in democracy and the institutions. Let's put economic variables in the lowest, economic growth and inflation in the poorest values, and the predicted probability of being in a delegative democracy jumps to 90%. So that is what I'm trying to claim here. And this is only the beginning of the analysis. I'm taking very rough economic indicators and very rough indicators of how citizens view the regime, the institutions of the regime and politics, how they evaluate. When you have them on the average, the performance of democracies in Latin America tend to be good on average. But that is the problem with Argentina. These variables, especially those in the economic camp, were not performing very well. So let me finish by saying that out of this analysis, under conditions of economic growth, low inflation, and large public support for democracy, Latin American countries are likely to be representative democracies rather than delegative democracies, as usually we listen in some analysis. So on average, these democracies perform reasonably well, and if you have good economic conditions and good support for democracy, the probabilities are that they are all enter in the representative camp. The problem is, of course, as I showed you or tried to show, that when structural conditions deteriorate, and that has probably part to do with policies and the functioning of the economy domestically, but also internationally. And when public confidence diminishes, and these two variables, two aspects probably are interacting with each other, the probability of having a delegative democracy increases dramatically. And that has happened in Argentina since 1983. After each sharp economic crisis and a plunge in confidence in politicians and political institutions, parties, Congress, the judiciary, delegative democracy tends to re-emerge. Thank you very much. Lucio, let's start with the case of Brazil. I think I'm also more worried about Brazil than Argentina. I'm worried about the performance of policies in Argentina, especially economic policies. This was a government that was supposed to do better in terms of economic outcomes, but less in political terms. And I think it did well in terms of their politics, but less so in terms of economic results. But having said that, I think the prospects for the components of the causes of delegative democracy are less clear in the case of Argentina than in Brazil. In Brazil, you combine some discourses from saviors that are claiming that they are going to save the country. Even some of them remain nostalgic to the period of the military regime, which is, you were discussing that with me as well. A very deep economic crisis, one of the largest, if not the deepest economic crisis in Brazil, and a very, at least impressionistically, confidence in parties is not as it used to be. So we need figures of that in the case of Brazil. But these three elements are very clear. The discourse, the economic crisis, and low confidence in politicians and parties. So what we'll have to see is whether the institutional components of a very robust institutional setting because I tend to agree, Congress and the judiciary in Brazil are strong. It's still to see whether they can, these powers can tolerate a battering ram, as it used to be called in the case of the US. You see that the bureaucracy in the case of the US is having troubles facing a very strong president, strong at least in the discourse. So when you have, Skronek used to call those battering rams, the presidents during the crisis, no? They have to concentrate power. It's yet to see what is going to happen in terms of these consolidated and institutionalized components of the democracy in Brazil. What is clear is that we all used to think that Brazil was an institutionalized and consolidated democracy, and political scientists were very confident on that. And suddenly the future is not what it used to be. Quoting Acuña in a very interesting paper. The future is no longer what it used to be. So I'm really, if in the audience is somebody else who can talk about the case of Brazil, I'm very happy to listen, because it's one of the cases we have to watch and see. This is one of the worries. Venezuela is, of course, is another club, I think, in another group. And of course, it worries me a lot. And it should worry us all. But these two cases are, I think, demand some of our attention. Then why you ask me why delegative democracies improve or not. I discussed that again recently, but one thing that appeared in your impressions was that, and it was clear in O'Donnell that it was a very circumscribed process. O'Donnell was talking, and I mentioned that before, O'Donnell was talking about a very specific period of time. But I think this process, these processes of very deep economic crisis, very sharp falling confidence in politicians, and what politicians do under those circumstances, I think we deserve more attention from academia, and especially in the case of Brazil. We can discuss the technical aspect of it later on. I don't want to entertain the discussion only with that. But in terms of measurement and who coded it, what you do is you try to be transparent. So you have to report intercoder reliability, that is whether they agree or not, and when they don't disagree. And you have to mention who were the guys coding it. If I have all of them in one side of the political spectrum, it's a problem that I have. So I try to be more equal in terms of the political positions, but still it's very limited. But it relates to another topic, which is, if you analyze the institutional dimensions of democracy, we have data on that. And that is something very easily to code. The problem is when you try to analyze the actual functioning of democracy and the exercise of power. O'Donnell was trying to, in some way, analyze how power is exercised. And he was worried when presidents do not face restrictions from other institutions. And this is very difficult to observe empirically. So one part of the experts that I talked about in relation to this project said, pay attention only to the institutional observable aspects of democracy. And others say, well, this is the challenging effort. You are paying attention to aspects that are not immediately measured the way we used to do. And of course, I used these dimensions from the delegative democracy because the project was linked to a book that discussed the legacy of Guillermo O'Donnell. But I think there are some projects, and especially linked to that debate on quality of democracy, that I think I need to pay more attention. Thank you. Regional attitudes, that was Terry's comment. It's an excellent point. I can be extremely O'Donnellian in the reply, but if you remember, one of his pieces was brown zones. One of his concepts was brown zones. Brown zones were those areas in which state penetration was very weak or non-existent. And he was worried in that piece about the territorial aspect of state penetration. I mean, during many years, Colombia was probably, on average, a very stable representative democracy, but with blatant violations of human rights in some parts of the territory. And you can replicate that all over Latin America and all over many cases. If you go to the southeastern part of Chicago, you will see that this doesn't resemble a very democratic setting in the way you would expect it, especially when police forces will kill you because of race. So I think that that element is extremely important. We are actually gathering data at the provincial level to try to come up with some measures of state penetration, not only in the bureaucratic or institutional aspect of it, but rather in terms of what O'Donnell was thinking about, that includes those elements related to the exercise of power, to the existence or not of rights, civil, political, human, and stuff. So it's an excellent prospect of research, I think. And this is an area of research. The concept has been used much more than the empirical analysis developed conclusions. So I think it's an excellent comment. I'm not going to be good pronouncing your name, I'm sorry. I'm very much based in Latin America, Union. But gender and class equality, excellent. O'Donnell didn't include them out of political and civic rights. So if to that battery that includes the basic rights in a polyarchy, you include other basic rights in terms of gender, class, race, the environment, I think what you come up is with a better quality, another measures of and more sophisticated and complex measures of your democracy and the regime. And that is probably what the variety of democracies is trying to do. They use country experts and they use observable data to gather a lot of information about democracies, not only the institutional or the regime aspects. That is what I did in this exercise. I included only aspects of the regime. Honestly, I think Venezuela could have been worse without governors and mayors. And I think that is what happened in Russia. Putin weakened, and if you pay attention to the story of how he weakened regional powers, and he was very clever in doing that, clever in the sense if you want to concentrate power, not in terms of the political regime, but he severely weakened regional powers. He actually recreated the whole structure to elect, and he actually nominates out of a group that are proposed by the regions. He select governors. And by doing that, he was undermining check and balances. And that didn't happen, that hasn't happened in the case of Venezuela. We need to pay more attention to that. And if you remember the Federalist Papers, that was one of the elements that was part of the division of power. In the end, I think what we are discussing here is how much power you would like to concentrate. And one part of the story, go back to that debate, is in order to have quick decisions, you need to concentrate power. And that discussion was very much present in Latin America during many years. One of the justifications for the concentration of power during the Kirchner year was, well, if you need to redistribute income in an unequal society and you face those strong lobbies, you need to concentrate power, otherwise you cannot do it. The judiciary is conservative power in the conservative aspect we think about. But coming back to your comment, Yes, I think it's a crucial aspect of the division of power and limits to real power as well. Colin, the implications for Venezuela of the economic crisis, I think they're huge. And what we see is that the deeper the crisis, the more power is concentrated in the hands of Maduro. And the problem with that is that something that I don't pay attention, and Barbara mentioned is public demonstrations and public conflict on the streets. There are certain countries in which problems are solved in Congress. Argentina, many of the problems are not solved in Congress, are solved on the streets, and that is the case of France as well. And Venezuela moved to discuss some of the problems in terms of politics and policy in Congress, and for several reasons which are really bad, Congress plays a weaker and weaker role, and it's all about streets. And it's also, in some cases, 1 minute, 2 more minutes? No, it's going to take a little bit more, but it's interesting. Then we have a wine. Desmond King made a very interesting claim a week ago in Argentina. He said that the problem in the US is that historically, and coming back to the previous question, Andrews, the problem in the US was that regional concentrated powers, and I'm saying the opposite of what I was saying a moment ago, regional powers were very conservative, racist, and they limited democracy. You needed a strong federal government in order to weaken those regional powers that were very undemocratic. He was making the claim exactly the opposite that I was saying a moment ago. But the problem was that there were undemocratic regimes at the subnational level, and in the case of Venezuela, they were democratically elected. But in those cases, where you have a very deep concentration of power, protests were crucial. Demonstrations were crucial. And also in the case of Paraguay, I think in some cases you cannot rely on institutional powers because the democratic forces are on the streets. The problem is that not all democratic forces are on the street in Venezuela as well. And that is usually the problem when you have institutionalized conflict, uninstitutionalized conflicts outside the political arena, the institutional channels of the political arena. So this is where you see presidents resigning. Argentina won, but then 7 people died on the streets, and that is bad. That is terribly bad. So I would rather rely on institutionalized solutions for conflicts rather than having problems solved on the streets. And that is the perfect storm in Venezuela. You have Venezuela is getting closer to Zimbabwe. And let's be clear about it. That is, you put it on my account, but I think it's getting closer with the largest hyperinflation in the world, people dying because of political demonstrations, opposition leaders in jail, and this is not looking well. Raúl, Barbara, I think I blended the two of them. Raúl, dependence of commodities. 1 more minute and finishing. The interesting discussion was that during the periods of the boom in the prices of commodities, people thought, or some people thought, that that was the end of CEPAL or dependency theories, because what you had because of China was very low industrialized prices for industrialized products, and very high because of the demand of raw materials, very high prices of raw materials. But what those cycles showed is that international cycles affect dependent economies, and that is very clear. And the crisis during the 80s was linked to the international. I mean, when you have countries as different as Latin Americans, all facing very similar troubles, differences cannot explain similarities. There are certain aspects that should be similar to explain hyperinflation all over Latin America, or in many cases in Latin America. And those similar aspects are probably related to the international environment. Argentina entered into a deep, serious crisis of regime. It was not a problem with delegative representative, it was a problem with delegative and authoritarian regimes after the Conference of Ottawa. We were discussing it earlier with Tracy. When Argentina was not linked anymore to the economic center of the world, and you know the story probably much better than I, it started with this cycle that was not a cycle of, again, among democratic regimes performing not as good as we would like in terms of their check and balances, but it was a problem with entering very dark periods of time. And Argentina was actually one of the most stable democracies, most unstable democracies in the region, if not the most unstable. So I think we need to pay attention to those links with the economic center of power and also to the international dimension of democracy, of the economy, and its impacts on democracy.
Great. Well, with that, I would like to thank Lucas very much for talking to us this
Thank you all.
evening.